thank you very much for these remarks, and thanks also for adhering to our time limits, which continue to bind us, right? So this first panel and discussion is scheduled to conclude at around 1:50 p.m., which is quite close. I would like to invite the committee members to pose questions. And if they'll forgive me, I'll start by invoking the chair's privilege here to kick us off with one, which is, Carter, you mentioned that, WTO agreements do allow for restrictions on exports, for instance, key medical products. And yet, in the context of a global health emergency, these export restrictions, even if permissible, can impact the resilience of supply chains and the availability of products around the world. Might there be some scope for negotiation or even international agreements that could further constrain these and coordinate supply chains in a way that makes these disruptions less likely? I welcome comments on that, from both you, Carter, and from Monica as well.
I guess this was directed to me first. I'll go first, and then Des Gorman, I'll leave the cleanup for you to fix anything I say wrong. You're absolutely right, and I think there is some discussion about the role of this of the international trading regime. I do think there are a lot of political concerns that every country has to look at. There is always a balance between domestic need and your trade obligations and commitments. I think any changes to the existing structure result of very lengthy negotiations. And even if it is something that the majority of countries agree to, in any kind of negotiation like that, there is the chance that somebody is going to want something else, just a great deal complicated. So I think it's not unreasonable, but I think it would be the result of a very lengthy process. And it's all fun and games until you get the lawyers involved, which is what would happen to no doubt with that. So there's a lot of concerns that would go into that. So I think that's a very roundabout way of saying not a completely outlandish idea, but one that is fraught with complexities and will be the result of lengthy negotiations. Thanks.
I think Carter summarized it well. I think it's there's merit to the idea, but enacting it is challenging given the complexities of the situation that we're in. Lee, I did, since I have the floor, I'll take the prerogative. I did notice a question in the chat in terms of resiliency and whether or not resiliency, it's an inherently objective or subjective concept, which is true, but the working definition that we have right now is resiliency is sort of the ability to recover quickly from a disruption. So I do think there's opportunity for objective metrics to measure the time to recover from a type of disruption, and would welcome thoughts from the academic community as to what would be the ways in which that could be done at different points in the supply chain to start to build that into thinking around supply chain. So if we want supply chain resiliency, what are the metrics that show your ability, your time to recover? Ideally, it is as short as possible, because that shows that you're resilient to a shock. So just putting that out there, that's sort of the working definition that we have at the moment. But I think there's a real opportunity here for the academic community to think about how that could be measured, and we would welcome that. And frequency, yes, potentially. Sorry, I just see the monitoring the chat in real time, but frequency for sure. Clearly, the more frequent your disruptions, you would want to take a look at, do you have appropriate diversification or the appropriate supply base, such that you can never eliminate disruptions, but you certainly don't want to be dealing with constant disruptions as well. So would really welcome some thoughts and probably a conversation beyond the scope of this panel or the time that we have here today, but definitely an evolving area of thought for us.
Thanks. Aaron.
Quick clarification with regard to the Buy American proposals. Is there any thought to requirements for industry to disclose location of production so that we know how to actually implement that? For example, if the DoD only has to buy medications that are produced in America, with the current lack of transparency, how does that get implemented?
Well, I mean, to that extent, Buy American wouldn't really work that way. The provisions of Buy American essentially establish price preferences for domestic goods over foreign goods with our trade partners, that we have trade agreements with them that have a specific chapter on government procurement, or that are fellow members of the WTO's agreement on government procurement. And that's where we get into what we open up in our markets is a small percentage, well, is much less than what we get access to in the world government procurement markets. I don't know that anyone is talking about completely walling off sectors of the American economy, because it's just too many things marketing partners for that to really effectively work. That being said, you chosen a great example with DoD, which is carved out of many of those agreements. So they're not actually bound by that. They do when they can, but they have some different latitude just because requirements. So the devil's in the details, but I don't know that there's really an attempt to pull up drawbridges as much as really look at where we have already negotiated carve-outs for, like, for example, small business. What can we do to extend the use of American government procurement dollars for policy reasons that are not contravening our existing trade obligations?
I think I would add to that in terms of, if you look at Buy American for pharmaceuticals, I believe the threshold is currently unclear, and that there's been a court ruling saying, for example, that the source of the APIs is irrelevant to determining the country of origin, which basically means that companies that buy APIs from China but finish their product here can still supply federal agencies. So there's opportunity there to think about how those rules are defined and applied. And if we want to encourage more API production in the United States, then that may be something we want to look at.
Any questions from other members of the committee?
Well, Lee, while we're waiting, I wanted to add one more set of thoughts to what Das Gorman said about resiliency, since I opened that can of worms to a degree in my remarks. I also want to make sure that just to plant the seed with the committee to look not just at COVID and not just at COVID Part 2, the sequel that may happen at some point in the future. When we're talking kinds of public health emergencies, let's really make sure we're thinking about the true black swan event. And just because we've made it through one black swan event of the COVID-19 pandemic now, doesn't mean the next black swan event is going to look like this one. What if the next black swan event is or purple swan? So that adaptability is also a big factor that I like to examine in the resiliency, and I would encourage the committee to look at. Of, all right, how quickly can we adjust from whatever we're doing now to respond to whatever the next emergency is, be it a pandemic, be it a food crisis, be it a natural disaster, or whatever. Thanks.
Thanks. Craig.
Thanks, Lee. For Ms. Gorman, you mentioned in the context of sole source vulnerabilities, the fact that many private sector entities have very little awareness of that vulnerability, which raises questions about the database that they, and more largely the government, has to anticipate where those vulnerabilities will be most concerning, and they're developing then an appropriate interventional strategy to mitigate that risk. And I know you mentioned it in the context of private sector's responsibility, but what is the federal national approach to establishing a database that would clarify these kinds of vulnerabilities to work towards a more comprehensive approach to risk mitigation? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I would point first to the work done during COVID with the HHS. It's called the Control Tower. So that was a partnership with industry producing critical products for the COVID response, where industry came together with HHS to provide proprietary information and provide that level of data that would allow government level monitoring. Now, that was an emergency situation. So there's a lot of questions and thought going forward as to what are the appropriate roles in non-emergency situations for government versus industry, but there's a lot I think we can learn from the HHS work here and what has worked well, where has government been helpful, where is it really the role of the private sector. There are slightly more macro levels as we think about supply chains writ large, not just in health, but in other sectors, semiconductors, for instance. We are thinking a lot about what is the role of data, what data can we get, what data should we be monitoring, how granular or not should the government be getting relative to what private industry is doing as well. That said, I do want to reinforce the point for private industry, coming from supply chains. When everything's working great, the industry is probably not paying a ton of attention to what's happening in tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. But what you don't know can hurt you. And it is possible to have visibility, but it takes time and resources to have visibility. So there is a real opportunity, I think, here for technology to assist with more transparency for businesses within their own supply chain, potentially policy tools to encourage businesses to have more visibility into their supply chains. Because at the end of the day, businesses do need to manage their own supply chains as well. So a long-winded way of saying there is definitely a role for government here, and there's a role for private sector here. There is some work to be done to define exactly what those roles are, but it's a very active line of conversation, and we have a lot to learn from HHS and from COVID, and I think that will inform going forward.
Thank you. Nice answer. More to be done.
Larry, you had a comment in chat. Well, kind of a comment and a question. Would you like to raise that for our two panelists?
Yeah, just wondering, is there a segment, is there a country, is there a group that you believe is a successful model or an aspirational model in terms of the approach and solution that's needed? I will tell you, the reason I'm asking the question is I don't know. I can't think of one because they're all suffering from sort of the same just-in-time reduction in inventory, and decisions are being made based on, cost drivers and earnings reports and, things like that, cash flow, not for the good of the supply chain.
I'll take the first stab, and Carter, feel free to respond. I don't know that I can think of any particular sector or country or company that's done this perfectly, but there are some, if I think at a company level in particular, some who have been less hard hit than others. And the strengths of those who have not been as disrupted typically has relied upon greater visibility to who their suppliers are, contract terms. Contracts that are not designed just to exact the cheapest possible price at the latest possible time, but likely have a longer time horizon, and sort of stronger partnerships with their suppliers as a result. So to your point of maximizing profits throughout, that probably has a negative effect on resiliency if you're trying to extract every penny along the way. The more that there is visibility, transparency, and a time horizon that's a bit longer, the more likely there is to be strength and the ability to adapt when unexpected shocks happen. But is there anybody who's gotten it exactly right? It's hard to think of a specific example. We all have things to learn.
The generics seem to be a great example of what's not working. They're very low margins. They just don't have any interest. The higher margin businesses seem to be the ones that tend to think about redundancy and resiliency more.
The only thing I would add to that is I also can't think of anybody that really got it exactly right. I would say more of a counterfactual, just anecdotally. If you remember back to 10 years ago in the Fukushima disaster aftermath, what they discovered was, I can't honestly remember whether it was Toyota or Honda, but one of the automakers, you could not get a black truck. You could not get a black pickup truck for them because the one company that made the black paint for their trucks was in the impacted area. So what does that mean? It means we haven't learned our lesson. We're not taking the lessons from history forward, so we're doomed to keep repeating them. So that indicates that there really be a need for a policy rule or a policy intervention to guide business to making some of those better decisions, or at least making sure that those are things that are consciously thought through with businesses. But I said the margins of business are really going to be what dictates some of those discussions.
And supply chain visibility, we've talked about used automotive as an example. We've talked about as a group how just seemingly wrong it is that in the automotive world, a manufacturer can tell you where every nut, bolt, screw, and component is made, who the supplier is, where it comes from, how it's flowing into the final assembly plant. And yet you can't do that in medicine or medical devices.
Any other final questions from the committee for our first two panelists? All right, well, thank you both, Carter and Dr. Gorman, for spending time with us and helping us understand these complex issues. We very much appreciate it.